May I start? Welcome to the seventh Minghetti lecture. The name of Marco Minghetti, for those who it is strongly associated with the balanced budget achieved under his stewardship of the Minister of Finances in 1876. With a series of lectures named after Minghetti, the Institute of Economics aims to establish an authoritative and regular forum on the issues of public finance. Today's lecture will focus on the theory of monetary integration in the aftermath of the Greek financial crisis. 10 years ago, January 2009, the Stability and Growth Program update for Greece set the general government deficit at 3% of GDP in 2009. Quite a good result. Just a few months later, Greece was to enter, in the words of its then Prime Minister, intensive care. Yesterday, after 3 adjustment programs and 10 years of hardship, Greece said to issue a 5-year bond, its first rate since exiting its third bailout program in August. In another sign of recovery, the Prime Minister announced yesterday an 11% increase in the minimum monthly wage, larger than expected, but still below pre-crisis level. Time is right then to assess the Greek experience, which in Italian translates, I would say, as a big lesson. And very few people can do that better than George Tavlas, our today's speaker. George Tavlas has represented Greece at the Governing Council of the European Central Bank as the alternate to the Governor of the Bank of Greece since 2008, and he also has been a member of the General Council and the Monetary Policy Council at the Bank of Greece since 2014. In this capacity, he has participated in the management and resolution of the sovereign and banking crisis in Greece. He was involved also in the process of Greece's entry into the Eurozone as a key advisor to the Greek Central Bank government at the time. He is also a member of the supervisory board of the Hellenic Corporation for Assets and Participation, the sovereign wealth fund of the Greek government. In this role, he has been contributing to the design and implementation of the framework responsible for the privatization of state-owned enterprises, as well as for the overall management of a large portfolio of state-owned assets in Greece. Two highly distinguished discussants will complete today's panel. They do not need to be introduced. Paolo Savona, economist, professor, and banker, former Minister of Industry and Commerce, and currently Minister of European Affairs, and Carlo Patton, economist, professor, and former Minister of Economy and Finance. We are grateful to all of them for having accepted our invitation today. I will ask Mr. Tavlas to keep his lecture, let's say, and the discussion, keep the discussion to 15-20 minutes so as to allow for a few questions from the floor.
Thank you, Nicola, for that kind of introduction. Is this working?
Yes, sir.
It's on? Okay.
Yes.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be invited to deliver the Marco Minghetti lecture. Marco Minghetti's legacy is firmly associated with fiscal rectitude. His goal as finance minister during the 1870s was to balance the budget after many years of fiscal excesses, a goal which he achieved. It seems appropriate, therefore, that today my narrative will deal with the destructive consequences of fiscal excesses. My narrative will take place in the land of the euro. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the creation of the euro. While this anniversary will certainly be noted in official circles, there are not likely to be many festive celebrations to mark the occasion. Although there will be recognition that the euro remained intact during the greatest economic crisis since the Great Depression, a notable achievement. In contrast with the year 2009, which marked the euro's 10th anniversary, could not be more striking. Throughout that latter year, conferences were held to celebrate what at the time was considered to have been the major success of the boldest attempt ever by diverse sovereign states to reap the efficiency gains of a single currency. After all, evidence of the euro's success in 2009 had been plentiful. The euro had created a low inflation, low interest rate environment, even for formerly high inflation countries conducive to economic growth. It had fostered trade integration and the integration of financial and to some extent commodity and labor markets among its members. The number of participating countries had risen from 9 in 2009 to 11 in 2016. Notwithstanding the eruption of the global financial crisis in August of 2007 and its intensification a year later with the collapse of Lehman Brothers, to that point, the Eurozone had been relatively unscathed, untouched by the effects of the crisis. To help celebrate the Euro's 10th anniversary, at the end of 2009, the European Commission published a report that sought to explain the reasons that the critics of the single currency, including Milton Friedman and Martin Feldstein, could have been so misguided about the negative assessments of the euro's feasibility. The confident mood of the time was aptly captured by Joachim Almunia, the former European Commissioner for Monetary, Economic and Monetary Affairs, who put it as follows: a full decade after the creation of the euro, a full decade after European leaders took the decision to launch the euro, we have good reason to be proud of our single currency. The economic and the monetary union are a major success. Amidst the celebrations in 2009, however, in Greece, a crisis was unfolding that within a year would become what Krugman would later characterize as the mother of all asymmetric shocks. A shock that was bitter irony caused by the creation of the euro itself. Greece joined the Eurozone at the turn of the century in 2001, becoming the 12th member of the monetary union. What went wrong in Greece? And why did it go wrong? And what about the celebrated theory of open currency areas, which provided the intellectual case for the monetary union? What I will do today is use the case of the Greek financial crisis to underline what I believe has been the Achilles heel of Euro's fixed exchange rate regime, namely the presence of moral hazard. The belief that if a country found itself in trouble, for example, unable to meet its debt obligations, it would be bailed out by its Eurozone partners. To corroborate my argument, I'll compare external adjustment under the Euro's fixed exchange rate regime with under the classical gold standard of the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the latter of which served as the role model upon which the Euro's architecture was built. My presentation will proceed as follows. To set the stage, I'll describe what the economic literature had to say about the conditions needed for successful monetary union and the benefits and costs of monetary union in the years leading up to the creation of the euro. Next, I'll discuss the factors contributing to the crisis in Greece, and I'll describe the effects of that crisis on the Greek economy. I'll then compare external adjustment under the euro's fixed exchange rate regime with that under the classical gold standard. The key difference between the two regimes was the presence of moral hazard in the Eurozone and its absence under the classical gold standard. Before I turn to the actual subject of my presentation, however, let me share with you a brief diversion. Some years before the creation of the crisis in Greece in 2009, at the beginning of the century, a famous University of Chicago economist came up with the following words. in the following advice. Well, I don't think this is being captured on the screen. Yeah. So anyway, here's what this famous University of Chicago economist said at the turn of the century, some years before Greece entered the euro. It's hard to see why the admission of Greece to the monetary union should have been desired or allowed. In no sense was she a desirable member of the monetary union. Struggling with a burden of debt, her nominal admission was secured based on political influences. Certainly, it would be hard to understand on what other grounds her membership was attained. Who was that famous University of Chicago economist? It wasn't Milton Friedman. It wasn't Robert Lucas. Let me say, however, that this is a trick question, because although this person was a famous University of Chicago economist when he wrote those words, no one in this room, probably, with the exception of myself, will have ever heard of him. I'll come back to the quotation at the end of my presentation. But during the course of the conversation, during the course of my presentation, there'll be a hint of the nature of the trick that I'm playing. So let me begin by taking you back to the literature on the benefits and costs of monetary union at the dawn of the euro. I'm beginning with the work of Bob and Dell at the, I'm just having, beginning with the work of Bob and Dell in open currency areas in 1961, economic research had identified the conditions under which nations should adopt a common currency and follow a common monetary policy, and the benefits of participating in such a currency arrangement. The literature pointed to several key conditions that were thought to be necessary for monetary unification. These included the similarities of the characteristics of the economies concerned, and to reduce the potential of asymmetric shocks. The similarity of such matters as the labor market institutions of the countries concerned, their inflation histories, their levels of economic development, and their production structures. Crucially, in the absence of the exchange rate instrument, the literature also prescribed the need of alternative adjustment mechanisms, especially labor mobility, wage price flexibility, and fiscal integration to smooth the asymmetric shocks should they occur. The benefits of a common currency were known to include the elimination of the transactions costs of exchanging currencies, the reduction in uncertainty produced by exchange rate volatility, and the elimination of competitive devaluations, thereby facilitating trade among the members. The main disadvantage attributed to a common currency, and was an important one, was the loss of the monetary policy independence and the exchange rate instrument to restore external balance. Therefore, the need for alternative adjustment mechanisms among the members, which I mentioned, especially fiscal integration. The main disadvantage of a common currency was known, and it was an important one, was the loss of the potential to reduce to asymmetric shocks because of the loss of both monetary policy independence and the exchange rate instrument to restore external balance, hence the need of alternative adjustment mechanisms. That was the state of play of the economics literature as of the 1980s. The overall verdict of that literature was that, except under rather unusual circumstances, typically applying to extremely small and open economies, The cost of joining a monetary union were likely to outweigh its benefits. Then, three things happened that strongly supported the view that the cost of joining a monetary union would be less and the benefits would be greater than had earlier been thought, leading to the belief that the needs of similar economic characteristics and alternative adjustment mechanisms, such as fiscal integration, were not that very important. First, for some reason, Alberta, this seems to be going back to the conclusions every time I switch it, but anyway, let me try. First, the progression of speculative attacks against pegged exchange rate regimes in the 1990s, beginning with the currencies participating in the exchange rate mechanism of the European monetary system in 1992-93, and then continuing with the Mexican peso and other Latin American currencies in 1994-95, the East Asian currencies in 1997-98, and then the Russian ruble, Brazilian real, and the Argentine peso at the end of the decade, persuaded a sizable part of the economics profession, including economists at the IMF, of the validity of what's called the hypothesis of the vanishing middle exchange rate regime. Underlying this hypothesis was the view that years of rising capital market integration rendered pegged exchange rate regimes especially susceptible to speculative attacks. Therefore, for countries well integrated into global financial markets, there was little, if any, middle ground between the corner solutions of floating exchange rates and monetary unification. If countries wanted to reap the benefits of exchange rate certainty, they would have to move all the way toward monetary unification. Second, in separate papers, Frankel and Rose, and then Rose, provided evidence indicating that the adoption of a common currency leads to greatly increased trade integration on the order of 200 to 300% among the members of the monetary union, over and above that produced by fixed exchange rates among separate currencies. The conclusions that followed from this evidence were striking. Since monetary union encourages trade integration, it also encourages greater business cycle synchronization through the higher trade linkages among the countries of the monetary union. A corollary of increased business cycle synchronization is that monetary union can itself make asymmetric shocks less likely, reducing the advantage of a country-specific monetary policy. Third, the literature on policy credibility, especially work by Barrow and Gordon and Gervasi and Pagano, led to the view that the adoption of a common currency arrangement can be entirely motivated by the desire to commit to more efficient monetary practices. Hence, the loss of domestic monetary control may actually be beneficial. Experience has indeed shown that countries with histories of high inflation often have difficulty in stabilizing their economies by using policies at the national level. For example, by making the central banks independent or by pegging the currency to that of the credible country. They have a far better chance of eliminating the domestic inflation bias practically overnight by joining a union with a credible monetary institution such as the European Central Bank. Some of the countries that joined the euro are understood to have acted according to that thinking. And that brings me to the case of one of those countries, that of Greece. In line with the predictions of the theory of the literature on endogenous trade creation and policy credibility, the entry of Greece into the Eurozone in 2001 was expected to mark a transformation in the country's economic performance, which during the 1980s and 1990s had been mired, had been stuck in high inflation rates, anemic real growth rates, high interest rates, large fiscal and external imbalances, and a series of exchange rate crises. Adoption of the euro was expected to produce a low inflation, low interest rate environment conducive to economic growth. And that's precisely what happened, at least for a while. From 2001 until 2009, inflation moved into the low single digits, and real growth at around 4% a year was the second highest in the Eurozone. And interest rates, they came tumbling down. The spread between 10-year Greek and German sovereigns fell from over 600 basis points in the late 1990s to between 10 and 20 basis points several years after Greece joined the euro. Greece had found the magic formula for economic success, and so it seemed. But because beneath the surface, deep-seated problems were left unaddressed. Economic growth was being underpinned by an expanding government sector. And related to that situation, the country was uncompetitive internationally. Consider the following developments, mainly during the period from 2001, the year of entry into the Eurozone, until 2009, the year in which the Greek crisis broke out. As you can see in the figure below, fiscal deficits above. Fiscal deficits consistently topped 5% of GDP, peaking at 15% at the end of the period. That's, you also can see from the figure above. The widening of the fiscal deficits was mainly expenditure-driven. The share of government spending in GDP rose by between 8 and 9 percentage points to 54%, mainly during a period, I might add, that had a government run by a conservative party. The share of government debt in GDP rose from under 100% in the late 1990s to almost 110% in 2008, and then 126% in 2009. Greece's competitiveness, as measured by unit labor costs against its major trading partners, deteriorated by 30% during that period. The loss of competitiveness along the relatively high growth rates led to a widening of the current account deficit. Greece joined the Eurozone with an already large current account deficit of almost 7% of GDP. By the end of the period, it has widened to 15%. Despite these large and growing imbalances, which should have sounded loud warning alarms for the financial markets but did not do so, and despite the outbreak of the global financial crisis in August of 2007, interest rate spreads on Greek sovereigns remained at low levels until 2009. Financial markets continued to treat Greek sovereigns as if they were almost as good as German sovereigns. And low interest rates greased the wheels of fiscal expansion by sending a message to opportunist policymakers that there was no price to pay for the buildup of sovereign debt. How could spreads remain so low and for so long, despite the large imbalances? There were several interrelated explanations. First, there was the view propagated most prominently in the Commission's influential 1990 study, One Market, One Money. Some of you probably recall that study. And subsequently by Blanchard and Giovanazzi, that current account imbalances don't matter in a monetary union. Underlying this view is the idea that intertemporal utility maximization helps ensure that diverging current account positions are the natural consequence of a convergence process among countries with different levels of economic development. In the presence of financial markets that are integrated, Countries with relatively low per capita incomes, such as Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, should run current account deficits and should attract capital flows because of high productivity growth and relatively high rates of return. Second, lenders may have believed that the Stability and Growth Pact's fiscal provisions would eventually kick in at some point, forcing Greece onto a sustainable path of public finances. Third, and most importantly, lenders apparently believe that despite the Maastricht Treaty's no bailout provisions, if things went wrong in Greece, Greece's Eurozone partners would be obliged to bail out the country in order to maintain the cohesion of the monetary union and to prevent negative spillovers to other countries. After all, non-Greek banks held the bulk of Greek sovereigns, as I will be documenting. Therefore, Greek default will call their viability into question. The fiscal party was nice while it lasted, but then came the wake-up call. And with the wake-up call came the fiscal hangover. In October 2009, the newly elected Greek government stunned the markets with the news that the fiscal deficit for that year would be running at more than double the projection made just somewhat earlier by the outgoing government of between 5.5% to 6% of GDP. In fact, at the beginning of that year, the then government had projected a fiscal deficit of 3.7% of GDP. The final figure would be more than 15%. Against the backdrop of fragile international financial markets, interest rate spreads on Greek sovereigns began an incessant upward climb. By May 2010, spreads had reached 1,000 basis points. Despite an adjustment program with the IMF and Greece's Eurozone partners, spreads continued their upward march, reaching 4,000 basis points at the beginning of 2012, as the Greek government agreed to a second adjustment program and restructured its debt, a matter to which I will return. A third adjustment program followed in 2015. What started out as a sovereign debt crisis spilled over to the banking system. The theory of open currency errors paid essentially no attention to banking issues. The crisis in Greece and in other Eurozone countries, however, called attention to the fact that in the absence of the banking union, Eurozone sovereigns and banks seem to be irrevocably linked. Among other things, this circumstance reflected the fact that the average ratio of bank assets to GDP in Eurozone countries at around 360% at the outbreak of the crisis, and this compares to below 80% for US banks, implied that the fiscal consequences of banking failures were potentially large enough to call state solvency into question. The twin crises in Greece generated negative feedback loops between the banking system and the sovereign. Falling government bond prices reduced banks' collateral, weakening the banking system, placing greater strains on the sovereign, and exacerbating the contraction in GDP. But a contracting GDP, along with deflation, meant a shrinking denominator in the debt to GDP ratio. As a result, the debt dynamics worsened. The crisis became self-perpetuating. 9 years and 3 adjustment programs, including a major debt restructuring since the start of the crisis, the effects on the economy have been devastating. At the peak of the crisis, Real GDP contracted by 30% from its 2008 level. The unemployment rate rose from 8% in 2008 to a peak of 27%. It's since fallen to about 18%. By way of comparison, during the height of the Great Depression in the United States, during the early 1930s, real GDP fell by a cumulative 28% compared to 30%. The unemployment rate at the peak of the Great Depression peaked at 25%. It peaked at 28%. During the Great Depression in the United States, that economy experienced 11 quarters of negative growth year on year. During the Greek crisis, the economy experienced 21 quarters of negative growth. Some 400,000 Greek workers, typically workers with higher skills, have emigrated to other countries. This amounts to more than 8% of the labor force. And this is the way that adjustment was supposed to work under the Mundell framework. Mundell and the other originators of the theory of monetary integration, however, didn't foresee the negative consequences of migration. They didn't foresee that migration can have permanent negative effects on the productive capacity of the sending economy. Likewise, they didn't foresee that migration can reduce the tax bases of the countries concerned, making it more difficult to pay the fixed costs of running states, other retirements of those left behind. And they didn't foresee that migration Why were the effects of the crisis on the Greek economy so devastating? There were a number of reasons. First, the fiscal and current account deficits in Greece were larger than in those in other crisis countries. Therefore, the required amount of adjustment was greater. Second, the adjustment mix was sometimes far from optimal. During the first adjustment program, for example, that mix comprised 40%, mainly 60% tax increases and 40% revenue declines. This mix had several consequences. By reducing the after-tax rate of return on investment, it reduced the incentive for companies to invest. And by reducing after-tax income, it restrained private consumption. Sharp mandated reductions in pensions and wages contributed to declining aggregate demand. Moreover, one of the areas in which government spending was most sharply scaled back was public sector investment, a key contributor to the country's future economic growth. Third, structural weaknesses in Greece ran more deeply than in other crisis countries and proved more difficult to correct. One reason for that difficulty was that it proved very difficult to reach agreement among the governments at the time and the official lending institutions over what were clearly necessary reforms. It also proved very difficult to reach agreement between the government and the lending institutions among the institutions themselves over what were necessary reforms. This circumstance often led to protracted negotiations, declining confidence, and delaying recovery. Once the government and the institutions agreed to certain fundamental reforms, there was often a lack of ownership of the reforms. And related to that, there has never been a comprehensive public dialogue over what went wrong in Greece and why it went wrong. And then there were the matters of both moral hazard and the debt restructuring. I'll deal with each of these matters in turn. First, then, moral hazard. The architects of the euro drew a direct link between the new currency and the classical gold standard. Valéry Giscard d'Estaing explained France's desire to create a gold standard type of regime in Europe as follows. During the second half of the 19th century, up to the 1914 war, France enjoyed continuously successful economic growth with a currency that was totally stable against other currencies. The French thrived on stable money, meaning stable exchange rates. In Helmut Schmidt's stated that we had a stable currency up to 1914 in Europe. From a historical point of view, I would draw a direct parallel between the gold standard and the euro. Why was the gold standard considered the model standard for European monetary union? There were two main reasons. First, under the gold standard, current account adjustments between surplus and deficit countries tended to be symmetric and self-correcting. Second, and related to that point, the gold standard acted as a discipline mechanism against the buildup of current account and fiscal deficits. Table 1 presents data on fiscal and current account positions of some European countries during the gold standard period. All of the countries, with the exception of Greece, were members of the gold standard for most of the period. Greece, however, was a member of the Latin Monetary Union, the purpose of which was to harmonize the gold and silver content of coins. Its members included, in addition to Greece, Belgium, France, Italy, and Switzerland. Several points are important to notice. And by the way, these numbers did not fluctuate much from year to year. First, fiscal positions in most cases were close to balance. Second, in most cases, the share of government spending was below 10% of GDP, compared with about 50% for many Eurozone countries today. Third, some gold standard countries ran sustained current account deficits, but below 3% of GDP. But the size of the deficits was small because credit risk was small. And credit risk worked to mitigate the buildup of large fiscal and current account deficits. Fourth, the major exception is the case of Greece, which in an effort to rebuild its infrastructure following centuries of foreign occupation consistently ran large current account and fiscal deficits. And it's no coincidence that, in contrast to the members of the gold standard, for most of the period, Greece underwent a series of sovereign debt and currency crises. Now let's take a look at the adjustment process in the Eurozone. Table 2 presents average growth rates of money, or M3, and domestic credit for Greece, Germany, and the Eurozone as a whole during the period 2001 to 2009. Notice that money and credit growth in Greece were considerably higher than in Germany, a country with a current account deficit. Greece with a country with a current account surplus. Greece with a country with a current account surplus. What is particularly striking is the faster credit growth in Greece at almost 17% a year than in Germany at around 3% a year. These flows contributed to much higher inflation in Greece than in Germany, the opposite of what was needed to adjust current account positions, to make Greek exports more competitive, but entirely consistent with the relative flows of money and credit in the two countries. Why is this circumstance important? Because it's often said that the Eurozone lacks sufficient wage and price flexibility to function as an optimum currency area. That may or may not be true. Clearly, wage and price flexibility are desirable components of a well-functioning monetary union. But my point is, even if there had been perfect wage and price flexibility, the flows of money and credit that occurred acted to exacerbate, to increase Greece prices relative to German prices, to make current account imbalances even larger than they had been. What caused money and credit to rise at high rates in Greece? The data on Greek sovereigns, on sovereign debt in Table 3, covering the period 2001 to 2009, provides some answers. Several points are important to notice. First, foreign money essentially financed all of the increase in Greek sovereign debt. while the stock of sovereign debt essentially doubled from 2001 to 2009. The share held by Greek residents dropped from 43% to 21%, while the share held by non-residents jumped from 57% to 79%. It was the inflows of foreign money that caused Greek spreads to fall to such low levels in the years prior to the crisis. And second, for most of the period, Greek banks were net sellers of Greek sovereigns. They used the proceeds to lend to the private sector, which is why credit to the private sector surged, as we saw somewhat earlier. Now, I've argued that adjustment under the gold standard was self-correcting, while the Eurozone lacked self-correcting adjustment. What accounts for this critical difference between the two regimes? The next figure helps point to an answer. It shows spreads relative to the UK, the gold standard center country, along with several gold standard peripheral countries, and along with Greece. Typically, spreads under the gold standard were pretty large, in the range of 100 to 400 basis points, despite the small imbalance that we've seen that occurred under the gold standard for those countries. The case of Greece is the exception that proves the rule. Its spreads were far above those of other European countries during the gold standard period because it had by far the largest imbalances. Why were spreads so high under the gold standard? The answer has to do with the presence of credit risk. Under the gold standard, the expectation that credit risk and therefore spreads would rise if current account and fiscal deficits increased, acted as a brake on the buildup of those imbalances. In turn, the small imbalances underpin the durability of the system. The situation in the Eurozone was very different. In the Eurozone, the belief by the markets that a Eurozone country would be bailed out by its common currency partner kept risk premium at low levels and acted as an incentive for the buildup of unsustainable amounts of debt. The Eurozone had a moral hazard problem. The gold standard did not. Earlier I mentioned that Greek banks got into trouble because they held large amounts of Greek sovereigns on the balance sheets. But as we've seen by 2009, 80% of non-Greek sovereigns were held by non-Greek residents, mainly non-Greek banks, especially French, German, and Dutch banks. Yet it was the Greek banks got into trouble because of the debt restructuring. How do we square these facts? The answer in part relates to the ECB Securities Market Program, the S&P, the initiation of which coincided with the start of the first Greek adjustment program in May 2010. Under the S&P, the ECB intervened in the secondary bond markets, purchasing large amounts of debt, distressed debt from Eurozone banks. The official purpose of the S&P was to repair the monetary transmission mechanism. Could the S&P have had further implications apart from the repair of the monetary transmission mechanism? Former Bundesbank President Karl Otto Pohl thought so. Here is what he said in an interview published in Spiegel in May 2010, 1 week after the initiation of the S&P. He said the following: it was about protecting German banks and especially French banks from debt write-offs. Let's look at the facts. During 2010 and 2011, Euro system purchases under the S&P included about 46 billion of Greek sovereigns. 46 billion. How much of that 46 billion do you suppose was purchased from Greek banks? Well, I can't give you a precise name, a number, because the information is confidential. But I can say the following. The overwhelming amount, and I'll repeat, the overwhelming amount was purchased off the balance sheets of non-Greek banks. In fact, during the period of the S&P, Greek banks increased their holdings of Greek sovereigns. Now, why would Greek banks behave in a way that during a time when non-Greek banks were aggressively selling Greek sovereigns? One reason may be that since the purpose of the S&P was to maintain the prices of distressed sovereigns, Greek banks knew that the value of their collateral, which included large amounts of Greek sovereigns, depended upon the success of the S&P. Therefore, they didn't want to engage in behavior that would have undermined the effectiveness of the S&P. And I want to emphasize that this is conjecture on my part. Whatever the reason, Greek banks appear to have been unprepared for the 2012 debt restructuring. And this brings me to the issue of the debt restructuring itself. I'm going to be covering some numbers, and I want to try and stay close to my written script on what follows for a while. In February 2012, Greek sovereign debt was restructured. The nominal haircut was 37%. In present value terms, the haircut was 75%. Now remember, the Euro system had purchased 46 billion under the S&P, essentially all of it from non-Greek banks. Several weeks before the debt restructuring, the ECB decided to swap its holdings of Greek sovereigns against new Greek bonds of the same value and the same terms, but in such a way that the new bonds would be legally excluded from the debt restructuring. One effect of this decision was that since the universe of bonds to be restructured was reduced, the effectiveness of the debt restructuring was also reduced. Moreover, under the S&P, the ECB purchased the Greek bonds at a fraction of the nominal value, as low as 30%. The Greek state had, of course, to pay back at maturity 100% of the nominal value of the bonds purchased by the Euro system. Since these bonds were excluded from the debt restructuring, the ECB made significant progress. In 2012, the Euro group agreed, conditional on Greece's compliance with a set of austerity commitments, Eurozone governments would return the Eurozone profits to Greece. Up to 2017, the profits amounted to 13 billion euros, almost 13,000 euros, 13 billion euros. From this amount, so far, only 2.1 billion has in fact been returned to Greece. As I mentioned, the haircut applied to Greek debt was about 53%. Some 200 billion was subject to the debt restructuring, meaning that the debt restructuring amounted to 100 billion euros of Greek debt. And because Greek banks had been buying Greek sovereigns for the preceding 2 years, they took a major hit from the debt restructuring and had to be recapitalized. Greek pension funds, which also had large amounts of Greek sovereigns, also took a major hit. The Greek government had to borrow 50 billion from the institutions, most of which was for the purpose of recapitalizing the Greek banks, which had suffered because of the debt restructuring. The Greek taxpayers and pensioners took the burden. So much for the debt restructuring. Let me now return to the issue of adjustment in the Eurozone. Once the crisis broke out, how was the current account adjustment achieved under the Euro's fixed exchange rate regime? Table 4 provides relevant information. It reports data on current account positions from 2008 to 2017 for Greece, Ireland, Portugal, and Spain, which I call the South. I chose 2008 as a starting year because the current account deficits of each of the crisis countries reached their peaks in 2008. And of course, 2008 preceded the year of the outbreak of the crisis. For purposes of comparison, the table also shows the current account positions of 4 countries that I call the North: Austria, Germany, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands. I selected the 4 countries of the North because the current account surpluses relative to GDP were the highest in the Eurozone in 2008. Notice the current account adjustment has been substantial for the crisis countries. The average current account balance of those countries improved by more than 14 percentage points of GDP. Also notice that adjustment has been asymmetric. All of the adjustment has occurred among the countries of the crisis countries. The average current account surplus of the North improved the opposite of what would normally be expected under a symmetric exchange rate regime. The opposite of what occurred under the gold standard. So where does adjustment stand in Greece? Greece has made substantial adjustment against the background of asymmetric adjustment. It's even made, I would characterize, remarkable adjustment, progress. Consider the following developments since the outbreak of the crisis. In 2009, the fiscal deficit was, as we've seen, 15% of GDP. During each of the past 4 years, the budget balance has swung into a small surplus. The structural fiscal deficit, that is a deficit that takes account of the business cycle, has improved by 18.5 percentage points of GDP. The primary fiscal deficit, the deficit that excludes interest payments, was 10.1% of GDP in 2009. During each of the past 2 years, the primary balance has swung into a surplus of 4% of GDP. What makes these achievements even more impressive is that they've taken place often against a contracting economy, which creates moving targets for fiscal consolidation. Greece's fiscal consolidation is one of the largest ever recorded by any country at any time. In gross terms, fiscal adjustment measures amounting to 35% of GDP have been implemented between 2010 and 2018. In net terms, the figures, of course, somewhat smaller because the gross measures sometimes have the effect of making the economy contract. The banking system has been consolidated from 20 banks at the beginning of the crisis to 5 banks at present. Non-performing loans remain a major problem and have held back credit growth, which is needed to underpin robust growth. Competitiveness, as measured by unit labor costs against its major trading partners, has improved by 35% of GDP. And as we've seen, the current account balance has improved by some 15% of GDP. What was staying in the Eurozone really worth all that painful adjustment? And that brings me to some lessons that can be distilled from the Greek crisis. The first point concerns moral hazard. The earlier literature on monetary integration thought that moral hazard could be dealt with in a straightforward way. In the case of the euro, through the Maastricht Novelo provision and through the fiscal provisions of the Stability and Growth Pact. That literature was, to say the least, naive. The belief by the markets that a Eurozone country would be bailed out by its common currency partners kept risk premium at low levels, encouraging profligacy, and leading in a self-sustaining way to bailouts in order to maintain the cohesion of the monetary union and to prevent negative spillovers to other countries. In the presence of moral hazard, market discipline proved to be an effectual instrument for keeping spendthrift governments, consumers, and companies in check. When market discipline did come, it came late in the day, far too late to prevent the bailouts that the Maastricht Treaty aimed to prevent. The Eurozone needs to develop effective tools that eradicate moral hazard. Second lesson, it pays to be virtuous in the monetary union. To explain, consider the case of Germany. In 2008, that country ran a current account surplus of 5.5% of GDP. 10 years later, 10 years of successive current account surpluses later, that country's surplus has risen to 8% of GDP, while its nominal exchange rate against the dollar in light of the crisis has depreciated by 25%. The opposite of what would normally be expected from a country running large current account surpluses. The country has also benefited unintentionally from capital flight from the crisis countries, from the ECB's assets purchases, and, as I mentioned earlier, from the support of its banks under the Securities Market Program, the S&P. A result has been near zero interest rates, robust growth, and full employment at about, the last I checked, was 3.8%. In contrast, consider the anti-virtuous, the case of Greece. Greek banks did not benefit under the S&P, although the purported purpose of the S&P was to support distressed sovereigns. And Greek sovereigns have not been purchased under the ECB's asset purchases because they are below investment grade. The result, a prolonged and painful internal devaluation. Given the prolonged and internal devaluation, should Greece have exited the Eurozone? Would a nominal exchange rate depreciation of its own currency have made things easier? And that brings me to the third lesson, the cost of exit. Following the example of the 1930s gold exchange standard, under which those countries that broke from that regime and devalued the currencies in the early 1930s and therefore resumed economic growth sooner than those countries that remained under the gold standard, it was assumed that exiting the monetary union would be relatively costless. In fact, leaving the Eurozone would be extraordinarily expensive for Greece. In contrast to the gold standard, under which countries retain the same currencies upon exiting that regime, Greece would not only be switching currencies, but it would be reintroducing an abandoned national currency, the drachma, one that was associated with high inflation and high interest rates. the credibility costs of switching would be enormous. Now, that's not all. There would be other costs of exiting the monetary union. While printing money could help finance the fiscal deficit, it wouldn't help finance the external deficit. No foreign agent would be willing to accept payment in drachma or to extend credit to the country. Pressure to implement reforms needed to strengthen competitiveness might likely be relaxed, perhaps abandoned, condemning the country to poor economic performance for many years. The central bank might lose its independence, now fiercely guided by the euro system. The likely return of high inflation and high interest rates would reverse any short-term gains of a currency devaluation. And then there's a matter of sovereign debt. While most of the sovereign debt would likely be redenominated in euros, debt service costs measured in the new national currency would rise by the amount of any currency depreciation. If the country decided unilaterally to redenominate its debt into the new national currency, that would keep debt service unchanged for the debtor, but it would lower it for the creditor, undermining the country's credibility. In either case, interest rates would rise, seriously penalizing the country. My conclusion: for countries with histories of profligate policies, life outside the monetary union would likely be characterized by high inflation, weak growth, and periodic crises. But there's a better quality of life if it's recognized that for those countries, such as Greece, years of profligate policies, fiscal, external, exchange rate, and monetary, had for much more years done much more harm than good. There's a better quality of life if a country plays by the rules in the monetary union. It plays to be fiscally virtuous in the monetary union. Now, let me return to the quote that I introduced at the beginning, which again is not showing up, and I apologize for that. But I'm a nice guy, so I'm not going to take it out with my people back in Greece. Not, at least not very much. Here's what the quote said. It's hard to see why the admission of Greece to the monetary union should have been desired or allowed. In no sense was she a desirable member of the monetary union, struggling with the burden of debt. Her nominal admission was secured based on political influences. Certainly it would be hard to understand on what other grounds her membership was attained. Who was that famous Chicago? Wasn't Bob Lucas. It wasn't Milton Friedman. It wasn't Gary Becker. Who was it? Well, I apologize for this because I had a picture of him. But he wasn't such a very good-looking guy, so you don't miss anything. His name was H. Parker Willis. Now, H. Parker Willis, a famous University of Chicago. Well, I said that these words were said at the turn of the century, but I didn't say at the turn of what century. Those words were written at the turn of the last century. Willis graduated from the University of Chicago in the late 19th century, and he taught there during the late 19th century and the early 20th centuries, becoming one of the architects of the Federal Reserve System in 1913, becoming one of the most famous U.S. economists at the early part of the 20th century. The quote in question is from a book titled Latin Monetary Union, which he published in 1904. And no, don't forget that during the course of my presentation, I had mentioned that Greece was a member of the Latin Monetary Union in the late 19th century. In any case, I thank you for your attention.